Chapter 1, Part 1 of the Life Story of a Russian Exile. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Life Story of a Russian Exile by Marie Sukloff. Translated by Gregory Yaros. Chapter 1, Part 1. The little village of Borovoy Mlin, in which I was born, consisted of about 30 huts, low wooden structures with slant-thatched roofs. The walls, both inside and out, were plastered with mud and whitewashed. All the huts stood in a row which formed the only street in the village. A wide, dusty road passed in front, the meeting place of the cackling, quacking, and barking members of the community. Farther down, the communal pasture, a long and narrow strip of land, ran along the high bank of the rivulet Okena below. In the rear were small kitchen gardens, surrounded by low wattle fences, back of which rye fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Our hut stood at the very entrance to the village. It was old and rickety. The two little windows were low, near the ground. In the severe winter months the snow piled up high in front of them, shutting out the feeble light that penetrated the double windows. During the greater part of the year the broken panes were replaced with cardboard, as a protection against the clouds of dust which drifted into the house every time a vehicle passed. The thatch on the roof was black with age. It was broken in several places. When the rains were heavy, the water leaked through and formed a puddle on the mud floor. As in all peasant dwellings, a dark passage divided it into two parts. One was the living room, the other served as a barn where the horses, cows, agricultural implements, and provisions were kept. The living room was large and square. One corner was screened off by a long red curtain. It was the parents' bedroom. 2 beds and a cradle stood there. The furniture of the rest of the room consisted of a large table and benches along the walls. Another table, much smaller in size, held a large brass samovar and a pair of silver candlesticks, the only articles of value in our home. An enormous brick stove occupied a conspicuous place in the room. Besides doing its regular service, it provided a warm bed in the cold winter nights. The children often fought for the privilege of sleeping on it. In this room I first saw the light of day in September 1885. In this house I passed the first 14 years of my life. 16 dessiatines, a little over 43 acres of poor soil, mostly clay, and a thatch-covered hut. This was all the property left by my grandfather to his 5 sons and 2 daughters. Note: my grandfather settled in Borovoy Mlin in the province of Vilna in 1851. The government granted certain privileges to Jewish agricultural colonists, exemption from military service for a period of 25 years being one of them. Military service in Russia at that time lasted 25 years, and the life of a soldier was terribly hard. Few ever returned to their native places. To save his sons from military duty, my grandfather decided to become a peasant. End note. I do not know how the heirs to this rich inheritance settled it among themselves, but in the end my father and one of my uncles remained the sole proprietors of the 16 dessiatines, they being the eldest sons and already married. At the later division of the property, 8 dessiatines and the house went to my father. Our estate, besides the land, consisted most of the time of a couple of cows, 1 or 2 horses, and a dozen or more chickens. When the crops were good, the 8 dessiatines yielded grain and potatoes enough to last the whole year round. But either because of my father's primitive methods of agriculture, or because of insufficient fertilizing, or because of droughts which are not infrequent in our parts, good crops were rather the exception than the rule. I remember a prayer which I learned when I was 4 years old. "O God, give us rain for the sake of the little children." Every morning before eating our modest breakfast, we folded our hands and repeated this prayer. But God seemed cruel at times. Severe droughts burned our fields, and famine threatened the whole district. Then father drove our favorite cow to the nearest town and sold her. The same fate befell the second one, and then we were without milk. But the cost of necessities was so high that money thus realized was not enough. Then father went to look for work, and stayed away from home the whole week. Friday evening the family eagerly awaited his return. The room assumed its holiday appearance, the table was covered with a snow white cloth, the candles lit, and the samovar, freshly polished, shone in the corner. But father took his place without saying a word. His face did not wear his usual cheerful smile, and we understood that he had not earned anything and was therefore sad. Silently we took our seats around the table while mother served the supper. But unlike any other Saturday, there was no meat. Indeed, it was absolutely necessary to earn some extra money to meet the modest expenses of our household. The few acres of land owned by a Russian peasant do not yield enough to feed a large family and pay the taxes. Our village was situated about a mile from the little town of Smorgon, where there were leather factories, tailor shops, and other enterprises. Among us, a child of 8 years was considered of working age and sent to work in town. He was apprenticed to a tailor or a shoemaker, and sometimes even sent to the factory. Few could afford to send their children to school. The parochial school, which was to spread knowledge among the inhabitants of 4 villages, could boast of but 10 pupils. These were taught by the village priest, who was but little versed in educational matters. Besides, he was busy with other more important duties, and could not devote much of his time to instructing the young. At the end of a 4 years' course, therefore, they could neither read nor write. But that was amply compensated by their ability to chant psalms, which they knew by heart. Our village boys went to a Hebrew school, beginning at the age of 4 or 5. My brother Wolf finished his education when he was 8 years old. Girls were not taught at all. I was illiterate until the age of 13. But more of this later. The peasants in the neighboring country lived in still greater poverty than ours. Their grown sons and daughters did not go to live in town, but remained with the family. Nor did they send their children to the shop, and their small parcels of land, which were taxed very heavily, could not feed so many souls. Close to their land was a large private estate. It covered many hundreds of desyatins, most of which was uncultivated. The peasants were thus deprived of a chance to earn even a little money as farm hands. One circumstance I remember greatly puzzled me, notwithstanding that I was very young at the time. The grazing land of our village was small, and the herd often returned home hungry. Bordering on ours was an immense pasture belonging to a priest who had long left the church and did not even live on his estate. The meadow was always guarded by a man who lived literally at our expense. He collected from us a ruble for every horse or cow which strayed over on his land. If the money was not paid, he locked the beasts in his barn and left it without food. Once it happened that he starved to death one of our herd. When winter came, the fine grass in the priest's meadow was covered with snow, while our barns were empty. A dense forest surrounded the villages, but we did not have enough firewood to heat our huts. The forest belonged to the government. The peasants had to choose between freezing and stealing wood from the forest. As a result, the jail in the nearby town was always full. Some stayed there as long as 2 years, all for attempting to steal a log with which to warm their cold huts. When I was 6 years old, a terrible misfortune befell our family. My mother fell down from the garret and fractured her skull. She was ill for almost a year. For 4 months she lay in a semi-conscious condition. She did not recognize anybody, and drove us away when we came to her bed. I don't know what would have become of us if it had not been for our sister Rebecca. She looked after us like a mother, and saw that we were fed and clothed. She was 11 then. Mother's illness ruined us completely. She was the only one in the family who knew how to manage things, to make ends meet, as they say. Father lacked that ability. Besides, her illness added a large item to our expense. To meet the doctor's and druggist's bill, the cows and horses had to be sold. Even the land was mortgaged. It was summer, and father worked in the field. Rebecca and I kept house and looked after the 1-year-old baby. We got up at daybreak and worked hard the whole day. Rebecca milked the cows. They were sold only towards winter, and I drove them to the pasture. I remember with what a serious face I answered my companions when they asked me to play with them. " I have no time to play. My mamma is sick." One incident during my mother's illness left an impression on my memory that remains to this day. It was the haying season. Father was in the field, mother was lying in bed, and Revecca and I were sitting on the doorstep resting after our hard morning. A large wagon drawn by 2 horses suddenly came into view. We recognized it immediately and knew that the tax collector was coming. He had a wooden leg and a long black beard, and was the terror of all the children. The periodical appearance at our village of this tax collector, who was nicknamed the One-Legged Devil, was always a source of much unhappiness. He stopped in front of our house. We were terribly afraid of him, and at any other time would have run away and hid in the barn, but that happy period of our life was past. We felt a great responsibility resting upon us, so we remained. We stood up and met the intruder bravely. " There is nobody home," said Revecca, when the collector approached. But he paid no attention to her, and went straight into the house, making an awful noise with his wooden leg all the while. We followed him. Having examined the contents of the room, he stopped before the table on which the samovar and the candlesticks stood. We watched his movements with breathless intensity. Suddenly he knocked on the window with his cane. A young man came in carrying a large bag. Before we could grasp the meaning of it all, our samovar, the pride and ornament of our house, had disappeared into his dirty bag. Next went the candlesticks. We were dumbfounded. We stood gazing at the bag and could not utter a word. Unable to move, we saw them turn to the door and walk out of the room. When we recovered from the shock, the rattle of the passing wagon was heard near the house. Revecca sat down near the empty table and began to cry. After a few minutes I joined her. Without a samovar and the candlesticks, the room looked gloomier than ever. In the fall, father called a doctor from Vilna, a large city 60 miles away from the village. His visit cost us 50 rubles. This doctor, however, really helped our mother, who began to recover slowly. When my mother recovered from her illness, Revecca was sent to work in a tailor's shop in town, and I became the chief help in the house. In the long winter nights I plucked feathers for pillows, which were to form a part of Revecca's dowry. She was then in her 13th year. Thus 2 years passed. Our poverty at that time was indescribable. All the earnings went to pay debts and the interest on the mortgage. To earn a little money, mother decided to sell vegetables at the town market. Every morning she went to town and returned home in the evening. I took charge of the house and looked after the 11-month-old baby boy. One event which set me thinking about conditions in general was the death of my aunt, a young married woman of 34. It was harvest time, and my aunt went to a nearby village to hire some farm hands. She started out before sunset. Hours passed, it grew late, and she did not return. About midnight the horse came back with an empty wagon. We raised an alarm, went to the village, but the peasants there, who all knew my aunt well, maintained that she had not been to their village that day. At last, after a whole night's search, she was found buried, yet still alive, in a pit near the road. Her face was unrecognizable. Her whole body was bruised and bore traces of violence. The police arrived and began an investigation. Our yard was crowded with peasants, young and old, from the neighboring villages. Each one of them was led to the bed on which my aunt lay, with an unspeakable expression on her mutilated face. She could not speak, but her eyes were full of suffering and mute reproach. Each time a peasant approached the bed, she shook her head gravely. The ordeal lasted 2 days. All that time my aunt tried to say something, but all of our efforts to understand her were futile. The police lost all idea of discovering the author of the horrible crime. My aunt was sinking fast, and the doctor could not hold out any hope. Suddenly she clearly uttered the word Bartchuk and died. Bartchuk? Note: young gentleman. End note. The peasants passed the word along and made the sign of the cross. They knew who committed the crime. A short distance from the village where my aunt had gone was a landowner's estate. The proprietor had a son who spent his summers in the country. He was the curse of the neighborhood. The peasants hid their daughters whenever he appeared in the village, but he managed to insult them with impunity. He it was whom my aunt named as her assailant. He was arrested. All the peasants testified against him, and yet after 3 months he was freed. The landowner had bribed the investigating magistrate, and the affair was hushed up. As I have said before, I was not sent to school. When I reached my 11th year, my mother found a place for me in a grocery store in town. The store was so small that if 2 customers happened in at the same time, one had to wait outside, where the greatest part of the goods was laid out. I performed a great many duties. I carried the goods in and out, swept the store, delivered purchases, and ran similar errands. My salary was 15 roubles for the winter. There I made my first acquaintance with figures, and learned addition and subtraction. My position as a clerk required some little knowledge of arithmetic. At first my mistress taught me. After this my brother Wolf instructed me in this science, which was one of his strong points. But months passed, and I did not show any promise of becoming an efficient grocery clerk. My mistress was very much dissatisfied with me. She often reproached me for my inability to meet customers in the approved fashion, and called me a rustic. I did not know what was wanted of me, and that worried me terribly. But I took great pride in the fact that I was a clerk and earning money. Every evening I went home to sleep. There was a tavern in town where the workmen from our village gathered, usually at about 9 o'clock. I always found there company to go home with. One evening my mistress kept me very late. When I came to the tavern, all my village folk had gone. I thought for a while, and decided to go home alone. It was in December. The night was still and cold, and the fields were covered with dazzling white snow. The road to our village shone like silver. I stepped into the road and ran. I did not stop until I came to our house, although I was not a bit afraid. After that I always walked home alone without even so much as looking into the tavern. Before the Easter holiday my mistress discharged me. She had found another girl who could approach customers in the right way. It was a terrible disappointment to me, but my mother tried to console me. "Don't worry. I shall apprentice you to a tailor next fall, like Rebecca. That's settled," she concluded. End of chapter 1, part 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.